For this week's story, I've written an Appalachian retelling of Cinderella. No glass slippers, fairy godmothers, or royal balls, just a walnut hair comb, a harvest festival, and a community that pulls together to dress Ella in their finery. While you listen to Ella's story, you'll watch me create this Cornhusk doll. Cornhusk dolls are common sights at our heritage festivals. We most likely learned how to make them from the native peoples that first lived here. Taking what you have on hand and making something useful or beautiful has been a part of these hills for centuries. If you found your way here because the world is a little too loud, you're in the right place. This is a quiet corner, a place just to rest your eyes and your mind. So settle in, let the story keep you company, and let's begin.
Cinderella, Appalachian Edition. Ella's daddy always said the ridge had a mind of its own. On mornings when the fog lay soft and low, he'd stand beside her on the porch and nod toward the tree line as if it were an old neighbor. "See how the ridge is holding her breath?" he'd murmur. "Wait till the sun clears that far knob. She'll let it go all at once. Watch close and you'll feel it." Ella held her breath, her bare toes gripping the plank floor. Then the sun would push up over the comb of distant hills, and the fog would shiver and lift in tatters, slipping back from the fence posts and blackberry brambles curling away from the creek. "There," her daddy would say, "the ridge let out her breath." He spoke of the land that way, as if it were alive and living life with them. Back then, it was just Ella and her daddy and the ridge. They were blessed to have the low fields, rich bottom land that stayed green in August when other folks' gardens were dry. They had fields of corn, chickens, a few head of cattle. Ella loved the land, the barn with its deep, cool shadows, the ridge that framed the sky. But more than any of it, she loved walking the fences with her daddy, listening to him talk about how to tend a place so it would remember you kindly. All of that was before anything changed on the ridge, before the strange envelopes came in the mailman's satchel, before Bernice. Bernice came to the ridge in a borrowed car with two girls squeezed in the back and a smile that never quite reached her eyes. "Girls," Bernice had said, voice sweet as sorghum, "this here's the farm I told you about, and this is Ella." There were suppers on the porch after that, and laughter that sounded harsh in the soft evening. Bernice slipped into the kitchen as if she owned it, touching Daddy's arm when she passed. Before summer was out, the preacher said words over them, and Bernice moved her and her girls' dresses into the house for good. The sickness came later, quiet at first. Her daddy got winded easy and had to sit more often for a spell. "Just getting older," he'd say. But the cough dug in, and the doctor began to come with his little black bag. One afternoon, Ella found old Judge Roy at the kitchen table with her daddy. Papers lay spread out, and Bernice stood behind her daddy's chair, one hand on his shoulder. "Run on out, Ella," her daddy had said, a tired kindness in his eyes. "Grown folks' business for a bit." She'd hesitated in the doorway long enough to hear Judge Roy rumble, "This way the farm's protected, held in trust till she's of age." Bernice's voice had floated after Ella as she stepped back onto the porch. "You can trust me in this. I'll see it's all tended proper." Ella never saw those papers again. When the cough finally carried her daddy off, the house felt both too full and too empty at the same time. Bernice wore black for the proper number of Sundays and then traded it for fancy, expensive dresses. Her daughters took over the good bedroom and the front room with its best chairs. Ella moved through the kitchen and fields like the hired help. "Ella, sweep this. Ella, fetch that. Ella, mend that." If she came in late from the farm work, supper would be mostly gone. Bernice sitting where her daddy should be, her stepsisters chattering. Ella would eat what was left standing by the sink. Neighbors saw Ella working like a farmhand and worried. "If the girl's needin' anything, Miss Bernice, you just holler. We all thought a lot of her daddy," they would say. The cold, cutting response would generally go along these lines. "Judge Roy put this place and that girl under my care. If any of you go meddlin', I'll have you in court so fast your head'll spin." Maude watched all this from further along the ridge, same way she'd watched Ella since she was small. She knew that neighbors were no longer welcome on the farm. She knew everyone went quiet when Bernice was around. Maude also knew about the trust that old Judge Roy had set up in Ella's name. One evening, Maude walked down to where Ella was hoeing the corn. "You're carrying a lot on them shoulders, girl," she said, resting her arms on the fence. Ella shrugged, not quite looking up. "Just work that needs doing." Maude watched her a long moment and then let out a slow breath. "Your daddy never meant it to be this way, girl," she murmured, so soft it was more for the land to hear than for Ella. She patted the fence rail, turned, and walked back up the ridge, keeping her own quiet tally of what was wrong and who might help her set it right. Maude watched the years turn, and it seemed like nothing changed. Then, one autumn, all that slow turning gathered itself toward a single night. The harvest festival was in the air. Men bragging on corn yields, women comparing prized recipes, and word went round that Judge Roy's boy Squire was back from law school. Bernice heard it all long before Ella did. The thought of old Judge Roy and his polished son put a hard shine in her eye. She filled the front room with ribbons and lace and a hired seamstress, turning her daughters into high-priced bait meant to hook the Roy name and tether her family to the judge's power forever. Meanwhile, Ella silently moved through the house, scrubbing, stirring, hauling ash, while festival talk floated past her as if she weren't there. She thought of other festivals from when her daddy was alive, lanterns swinging and music spilling down the road, but that belonged to another lifetime. It was a different kind of talk that caught Maude's attention. She heard how Bernice was fixing her girls up right. When someone asked quiet-like whether Ella would get to go, Maude silently shook her head. Her jaw set in that way it did when she decided a thing had gone on long enough. That same evening, Maude walked into her own back room and opened the chest she hadn't touched since her daughter's passing 10 years before. Folded there was the dress, a pale, shimmering blue that caught light like rippling water. It had been sewn with care, meant to be worn on special occasions down the years. But her daughter's life had been brief, and the dress had waited in that chest for joys that never came. Maude lifted it out, shook the folds loose, and laid it across her bed. "You wouldn't mind," she murmured to the empty room with a tear, thinking of her girl's laugh. "You'd have been the first to say so." In the days before the festival, the valley women began to arrive. One brought soft leather shoes with little buttons marching up the side. Another laid down a slender necklace, its stones the color of dawn. Teardrop earrings turned up, little drops of silver light that flashed when they turned. Bit by bit, the community built Ella the finest of outfits for the harvest dance. A silk shawl with elegant fringe, a fine petticoat, stockings as thin as gossamer. The ensemble looked magical, the kind of magic that comes from the hands and love of neighbors. "What if Bernice catches on to us?" one neighbor asked, worry knitting her brow. Maude's smile was small and hard. Bernice can't sue the whole valley for lending a dress. The day of the festival, Maude walked up the ridge with a basket of eggs on her arm, same as she had 100 times before. Inside, Bernice hurried her painted face past a mirror, snapping orders, her daughters fluttering by in bright dresses. "Those the eggs I ordered?" Bernice asked, tugging at a glove. And a few extra, Maude said easily. Figured you'd want a good breakfast tomorrow after all that dancing. Bernice laughed sharp and pleased with herself and swept her girls out the door. In another minute, the wagon wheels were crunching down the lane. Silence flowed in behind them. Maude called out softly, "Ella?" Ella stepped out of the pantry, wiping her hands on her apron. With Bernice gone, she seemed to grow an inch, like a morning glory freed from the night. "We haven't got long," Maude said. "Come down to my place." Ella blinked. "But you've got to trust me," Maude said, voice gentle, but leaving no room for argument. "The house will be standing when you get back." In Maude's back room, the blue dress lay across the bed, catching the last of the afternoon light. The shoes, shawl, and jewelry waited beside it. Ella stopped in the doorway, her breath catching. "Oh," she cried. Who's all that for?" "For you, Ella," Maude said. Ella shook her head at first, hands trembling. "I can't wear that, Maude. That's too fine. Folks'll talk." "They're already talking," Maude said. "Only it's about how Bernice has you working yourself down to a shadow, while every scrap of your daddy's hard work is getting carted away. The folks gathered this finery for you." She took Ella by the shoulders, kind but firm. "You belong among us down there. This is so you remember that, same as we do." They washed the dust from Ella's hair and arms. She slipped out of her work dress and into the watery blue, the fabric settling over her as if someone had measured her in her sleep. The skirt fell in a soft bell, swaying when she turned. Maude eased the shoes onto Ella's feet, buttons snug against her ankles, then lifted the pale shawl around her shoulders so its fringe whispered when Ella turned. Her work-rough hands carefully fastened the necklace at Ella's throat and set the silver earrings to shining at her ears. Then Ella reached into her work dress pocket. Inside lay a carved walnut comb her father had made. She carried it always, its surface worn smooth by his making and all the years she'd turned it in her hands. She determined to wear it, the one thing this night that was wholly hers. "Seems right to take him with you," Maude said quietly. Ella lifted her hair and slid the comb into place. In the mirror's warped glass, the girl who stared back looked like a mountain princess. "Lord," Maude breathed, half prayer, half pride. "They won't know what hit 'em." Squire Roy was the wheel hub that the whole festival spun round that night. Folks gathered and scattered around him like leaves in a wind. Farmers wanting a word, church women squeezing his hand, girls in their best dresses easing closer whenever a set was called. If he minded, he didn't show it. He danced when asked, switched partners when called for, smiled and thanked and bowed his head. Bernice had planted herself where she could see it all. She sat straight as a pokeberry cane, her girls planted on either side. She watched it all with a tight little smile as if it all were a contest she plotted to win. When he turned to some stranger's daughter, her mouth pinched, then smoothed again. "You see that?" Bernice murmured encouragement to her daughters. "He doesn't dance twice with a one of 'em. You wait, things'll be different with one of you." For Ella, the walk to the festival field felt like crossing the thin place between worlds. Ella's heart thudded, not from the descent, for this slope was as familiar as her own hand, but from the thought of being discovered by her stepmother dressed like this. At the field's edge, Ella paused in the last shadow. The festival lay before her, lanterns swaying from poles, music spilling from the stage, tables heaped with fruits of the harvest. Maude squeezed her arm. "This is where you belong, Ella, and we're all here for you." Then she disappeared into the shadows to join the crowd. When Ella stepped into the light, conversations faltered. No one had ever seen her looking like this. Women who'd loaned a hanky or a pin or a word of courage watched her with quiet pride. Men remembered whose girl she was and thought how proud her daddy would be. Ella felt every eye, every whisper, but she kept moving. Those who knew her name held it on their tongues, watching. Under the lanterns, amid music and murmur, she stood to them as someone newborn, yet more herself than she had been in a long, long while. Squire Roy had just turned from thanking his latest partner when he saw her. Later, if anyone pressed him, he might have said it wasn't the dress, though it was finer than most. It was the way she stood there, the set of her shoulders, as if the floor could shift and she'd still find her footing. He did not look away. Bernice pitched her chin high and followed Squire's gaze. Ella came into view, and Bernice's eyes slid over her the way they would over any stranger. Not in recognition, but in rankled curiosity that someone else might outdo her two girls. Squire Roy moved through the crowd without much ceremony, only a few quiet "excuse me's" as he went. By the time he reached Ella, the fiddlers had slid into a slower tune, the sort made for twining hands and measured steps. Up close, he dipped his head. "Evening, miss," he said, stopping just in front of her. His voice was low. "Might I trouble you for a dance?" "You might," she said. Her own voice surprised her with how even it came. "If you don't mind, I'm out of practice." "I don't reckon that'll trouble us," he answered. "I'll do my best not to lead you astray." He offered his hand, and it was warm when she set her fingers in it. He led her into the set, and the room arranged itself around them. Ella's daddy taught her dances in the farmyard when she was small, so her feet knew what to do even while her mind reeled. They turned once, twice, his steps sure, hers finding the pattern with each pass. His eyes stayed mostly on her face. "You from this valley?" he asked, quiet as they swept past the bench where Bernice sat stiff as a fence post. "I am," she said, "just beyond that far ridge." She tipped her chin toward the dark shadow of a hill that stood against the sky. "Ah," he seemed to turn that over. "So you currently know these hills better than I do." "I expect they know me," she said, before she could think better of it. That made him look at her more closely. "Then you'd be the one to ask how this place is holding up. It's been too many years of me just riding through, and that's not the same as living under 'em." "Land's like a person," Ella said. The words felt like something her father might have said, rolling up from some deep place within her. "You can't tell much from riding past the front gate and waving." His hand tightened just a fraction. "No," he said, transfixed. "I suppose you can't." They swung so near Bernice's bench that Ella could have reached out to touch her. The woman's eyes were narrow slits, taking the measure of her as she danced at Squire's side. Heat and noise rushed back in at the edges of Ella's thoughts. For a moment she had let herself forget there was any world beyond the lantern light. Then the weight of it all rushed back on her. The borrowed dress, the long walk home, Maude's careful hands fastening every button, the woman on the bench who would have her hide if she was found here. "I have to go," Ella said, breath catching. The music had not quite finished, but she was already drawing her hand back. His brows lifted. "Did I step wrong?" "No," she said. "You stepped just fine." She tried to smile and almost managed it. "I've stayed longer than I meant." Before he could speak again, she slipped free. In her haste, Ella felt her hair fall free and the carved walnut comb drop from its place. In her panic, she left her precious comb behind and escaped into the shadows. Squire snatched up the comb and pushed through the crowd, reaching the festival's edge a heartbeat later, but all he could see was the empty road. The dark had swallowed her. He didn't even know her name. Then he studied the haircomb in his hand. The wood was still warm, worn smooth by years of handling. On the back, carved small and careful, was the looping initial E. He looked out toward the hills she'd pointed to, as if the land itself might answer who she was. Squire Roy didn't wait for the dew to dry before he was in the saddle the next morning. He rode with his thumb tracing the carved E in his pocket, determined to find the mystery girl who spoke of the land as if it were kin. At the first house, the daughter was already on the porch. "I figured you might come by," she said, her cheeks bright. Squire held out the beautifully carved comb. "Might you have lost this last night?" he asked. "Maybe," she replied, "but I have so many." She reached for it, but Squire held back. "Tell me, would you say you know these hills well?" he asked. The girl giggled. "I guess so. I know a fine spot for strolling if the company's right." That wasn't quite the answer he was looking for, so Squire politely tipped his hat and moved on. At the next stop, the mother took one look at the initial on the carved walnut and pulled her daughter inside. "You'd best ask on along, Squire," she whispered. "It's no business of ours." A neighborly man sitting on his porch rail studied the comb and wouldn't meet Squire's eye. "You're riding yourself toward trouble you don't understand," he muttered. By late afternoon, the pattern was plain as barbed wire. A flash of recognition, then silent tongues. Every knowing glance pointed the same way, deeper into the valley. He pushed on toward the low country where the rich bottomlands stretched out green and wide. Bernice was on the porch before his horse had stopped, her daughters flanking her like matched bookends. "Well now," Bernice said, her voice sweet as sorghum gone a little sour. "Judge Roy's boy all the way down my lane. What brings you to our humble place?" He held the comb out, but kept his thumb pressed firmly over the E. "I'm looking for the woman who belongs to this." Both girls surged forward. "It's mine," they cried, reaching for the wood. Bernice stepped between them, reaching for the comb with a practiced smile. "Hush, girls. Truth is, I carved this myself for my eldest. My hands have a knack for it." Squire didn't let go of the comb. He kept his thumb over the spine. "If you carve this, Bernice, you'll remember what's carved on the inside without needing a look." Bernice's eyes flickered. She looked at her daughters, then back at the comb. "A flower," the oldest guessed quickly. "A mountain laurel, I recall." "No," the other chimed in. "It was a vine, to match the embroidery on my shawl." Squire pulled the comb back and slipped it into his pocket. He looked past them to the clothesline, where a thin work dress swayed in the wind. "It's a letter," Squire said quietly. "An E, worn smooth by a hand that treasured it, and it doesn't belong to anyone standing on this porch." Bernice's smile thinned until it was nothing but a line. "My daughters are the only ones here. There's no one else." "That's a lie that's lived long enough," a voice rang out. There stood Maude, her face set like flint. She looked straight at Squire. "You want the girl who belongs to that comb? She's hid away doing most of the labor around here while these three sit in the shade." Maude stepped up onto the porch, her presence forcing Bernice back a step. "Ella," she called, her voice ringing out like a bell. "Come on out here. It's time you're seen proper." Ella stepped from the kitchen shadows, her face smudged and her hair covered in a kerchief. But as she moved into the light, Squire felt a jolt of recognition. It definitely wasn't the shimmer from the dance. It was the way she stood, the set of her shoulders, as if the floor could shift and she'd still find her footing. Squire stepped toward her, the walnut comb held out in his open palm. "If this is yours, can you tell me what's marked on the back?" Ella didn't hesitate. "It's an E," she said, her voice clear and strong. "My daddy carved it for me." "Liar and thief!" Bernice shrieked. "She's a hired hand with a silver tongue." Maude stepped forward and spoke like a thunderclap. She's the owner of this farm, Bernice, and you know it. Squire, you take this girl to your daddy. Tell him to pull out the trust papers, the one he signed before Bernice started tending things round here." "You can't take her," Bernice lunged forward, but Maude stood like an oak in her path. "I'm taking her," Squire said, his voice hard as stone. He offered Ella a hand up onto his horse. Neighbors watched from behind curtains as Squire Roy, Ella, and Maude headed up the ridge. Little by little, people stepped out onto their porches and then filed in behind. By the time Squire reached the courthouse, a dozen families trailed behind them, their silence finally breaking into a low, angry murmur. Bernice's wagon tore up the road, dust billowing as she and her daughter scrambled out, desperate to reach the judge. Inside, Judge Roy looked up from his desk as the room filled with the county folk. He looked at his son, then at the ragged girl. Surely this was not his friend's daughter. "Judge," Maude said, her voice ringing off the high ceilings, "we've stood by and let fear of this woman's threats keep us quiet, but that girl has been living like a slave in her own home while you sat in this office and took Bernice's word for gospel." The judge looked at the crowd of neighbors who were nodding in agreement. He saw the way his son stood beside Ella, and he felt the sharp sting of his own neglect. "I relied on the say-so of a liar," the judge murmured, "and ignored the truth in front of me." He stood up, reaching for his gavel. "The guardianship is revoked on grounds of fraud and abuse. The sheriff will see the farm returned." Seeing the tide had turned and the law was no longer on her side, Bernice didn't wait for the handcuffs. She and her daughter slipped out the side door and fled the valley for good. A week later, Squire found Ella at the edge of the river field as the sun was climbing over the ridge. She was wearing her old work dress, but her hair was clean and held back by the walnut comb her daddy had carved her so long ago. "I heard the neighbors are helping you mend the back fence," Squire said, leaning against a post. "They are," Ella said, looking out over the pastures. "Said they owed it to my daddy." Squire was quiet for a moment. He just looked at the way the light hit the hills. "It's like this place is holding its breath," he said softly. "My daddy and I have enough law books to pave the road to town, but none of them can teach me about a place like this." They stood there together, watching the ridge let out its breath in a soft, rising fog. Two figures against the sparkling gold of the valley. "I was wondering if you'd mind if I walked the fences with you now and again," Squire said, breaking the morning silence. "I expect I have a lot to learn about how to make a place remember me kindly." Ella looked at him, a small, genuine smile reaching her eyes. "It'll be a long walk, Squire Roy." "I'm a good walker," he answered.